Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Hembrow Snyder, the coordinator of this inaugural lecture honoring Benedictine Sister Joan D. Chittister. At this time, President Thomas J. Gamble would like to offer a few words of welcome to all of you.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mercyhurst University. We're so glad you're here. A little earlier in the day today, many of us gathered to honor and to memorialize two Mercyhurst alums, two women. One, Sister Joan Chittister, very much still among us, and the other, Helen Boyle, who has passed on to her richly deserved rewards. We joined together to dedicate the Helen Boyle Memorial Archive in memory of Joan D. Chittister, OSB, as well as to inaugurate the Joan D. Chittister Lecture Series at Mercyhurst University, which you will soon get to hear. I would like to take this opportunity to express our deep gratitude to the entire Boyle family, longtime Mercyhurst friends, whose generosity and vision made the Helen Boyle Room, the Chittister Archive, and the lecture series we are about to hear possible. I also want to acknowledge my friend, Dr. Mary Hembrow Snyder, our leading Chittister scholar here at Mercyhurst, and the person who led this process from its rather inchoate beginnings to an excellent fruition. So to you, Mary, and to your committee for your thoughtful and creative and diligent work over the past year and a half to bring this culminating lecture into reality, thank you very, very much. Born a decade after the Sisters of Mercy built and opened Mercyhurst College, Sister Joan completed her undergraduate studies at Mercyhurst. Here she took some of her first steps in a life dedicated to educating and inspiring others and encouraging them to join her on the path illuminated by the teachings and the life of Jesus Christ. Over the years, she has advocated for women in the church and in society, for human rights, for peace and justice in the areas of war and poverty, and for religious life and for spirituality. And I'd like to believe that a Mercyhurst education, grounded as it has always been and will always be in the liberal arts and in the Catholic intellectual tradition, helped set her on that course. She completely and fully exemplifies what we aspire to in a Mercyhurst graduate. Sister Joan Chittister embodies the vision, the mission, the core values of Mercyhurst. Her work, now lovingly housed here in her archive, as well as at Penn State University and Mount St. Benedict, inspire us to, in the words of the prophet, act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with our God. So thank you, Joan, for all that you have made manifest in the world, and thank you to Helen Boyle and her children for making this historic moment possible. And of course, thank you to the Benedictine Sisters of Erie, as Joan would say, without whom she would not be Joan Chittister. And now I'd like to reintroduce Mary Hembrow Snyder, who will introduce our distinguished speaker for tonight's inaugural lecture. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Gamble. In a moment, I will introduce our distinguished speaker. First, however, it is only fitting that I publicly thank the key people who made this evening possible. First, to the family of Helen Boyle for their very generous underwriting of this new lecture series honoring their mother and Sister Joan. Second, to Dr. Gamble himself for his unwavering support as we prepared for today's events this last year and a half. To the Sisters of Mercy for founding Mercyhurst and educating Helen Boyle and Sister Joan. To the Benedictine Sisters of Erie, especially Sisters Susan Dubé and Ann McCarthy, for their assistance in arranging tonight's speaker, and to Sister Ann for preparing the PowerPoint about Sister Joan. To Judy Ellison of Bennett Vision and Sister Susan for the idea and creation of the memorable bookmarks we offered each of you as a keepsake. To Sharon Cisco, Events Coordinator, for her indefatigable support. To Parkhurst Dining for the lovely luncheon and pre-lecture reception. And to my colleagues in the School of Arts and Humanities, especially Dr. Alice Edwards, Dr. Daniel McPhee, and Michael Gleason. To these and so many more, my heartfelt thank you. Tom Roberts joined National Catholic Reporter, the Independent News Weekly, in January of 1994. A national award-winning journalist, he was appointed managing editor, overseeing the day-to-day operations of the NCR newsroom. He was appointed editor in 2000. Under his leadership, the paper received the General Excellence Award for 8 consecutive years, the highest honor given by the Catholic Press Association. It has also received numerous awards for investigative reporting, editorial writing, and design. In September of 2008, Roberts moved from the editor's chair to become editor-at-large, a move that provides the opportunity to do more extensive reporting and writing. He is the author of The Emerging Catholic Church, A Community's Search for Itself, published by Orbis in 2011. And he is currently working on a biography of Sister Joan Chittister, also for Orbis. Before coming to NCR, Roberts was part of a team hired in 1984 to rescue Religious News Service, a venerable, independent, ecumenical news organization that had fallen on hard times. By the end of his tenure, the service had been picked up for syndication by the New York Times News Service, a move that dramatically extended its reach in the mainstream media. Renamed Religion News Service, it is currently owned by the News House News Service in Washington, D.C. Roberts began his career at daily newspapers in Pennsylvania and spent 12 years at the former Globe Times of Bethlehem as a reporter and editorial page editor. It was for investigative and environmental reporting that he won awards from the National Journalism Center and the Scripps Howard Foundation. His reporting and commentary has appeared in a variety of publications, including Newsday, The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, The Chicago Tribune, The Tablet, and Christian Century. He has been interviewed on public television's NewsHour, National Public Radio, and CNN about church issues. Roberts attended DeSales University and Moravian College in Pennsylvania. He lives in Rockville, Maryland with his wife, Sally. The couple has 4 children, Rebecca, Daniel, William, and James. After his presentation, Sister Joan will offer a response. Please now welcome Tom Roberts.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Mary. I'm glad I didn't bring a fact checker along. The youngest child you mentioned there had a way of reducing all of that to one sentence. I think it was when he was late teenage years I was sitting at table one evening and going on at great length and probably with high-mindedness about some project I was involved in. And he looked up at me at one point and said, "Dad, you've been shoveling words for a long time, haven't you?" And so if I'm ever tempted to pride over that kind of thing, I just keep James in mind. I also would like to express gratitude to Mary for inviting me, to the Boyle family for making this archive possible, to Mercyhurst President Tom Gamble for also making it possible and being so gracious and welcoming me and my wife Sally. I am honored really to be here, and I know that's a bit of polite, mannerly expectation there. But this is more than just manners. I have felt the weight of this request far more than a lot of others, most others. What is occurring here, I think, is extremely important. The women of the Erie Benedictine community have done an enormous amount of difficult work that illuminates the way ahead for religious life in particular and for the Catholic Christian community at large. You also know that I'm from Pennsylvania, and I was a Catholic school kid in southeast Pennsylvania in Pottstown. And the good sisters there at St. Aloysius grade school and St. Pius X high school, mostly Franciscans with a few Dominicans, tried really hard to educate this kid. So to serve the truth, it's really not their fault. But you can understand how someone from that era and that experience stands in front of a room where there, I know, a lot of sisters who used to stand in front of those classrooms, just like the one I was in. And there's a little voice way back here that says, "Mr. Roberts, you're daydreaming. Where are you? Hands on the desk, eyes forward." And so we'll go. I first met Sister Joan Chittister in 1997 while I was covering a story for National Catholic Reporter. It was a symposium in Pittsburgh put on by New Ways Ministry, a group dedicated to issues of gay and lesbian Catholics. She was there to give a keynote address. It was clearly not the place to be as a high-profile Catholic writer and speaker if the intent was polishing the resume to get ahead in the institution. Then, as now, of course, polishing the resume wasn't Joan's intent. Her resume hardly needs polishing. And if advancement in the institution was her goal, it might be the only thing besides driving a car, as I've learned, which she's really lousy at. Resumes, however, do tell some of the story, so allow me a brief and partial recitation of the record. Her major publications include more than 50 books. Honors and awards go on for 2 pages single-spaced. They include 12 honorary doctorates, as well as her own actual hard-earned doctorate in speech communication theory from nearby Penn State. In the world of women religious, she was elected early to leadership positions, first as president of the Federation of St. Scholastica in 1971, president of the Conference of American Benedictine Prioresses in 1974, president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in 1976, and prioress of the Benedictine Sisters of Erie in 1978, a tenure that lasted until 1990. She has lectured, as you've seen in the archive space, at conferences and special appearances throughout the country and around the world. She's still scheduled out more than a year in advance. Her international travels take as lecturer, participant in symposia, activist for women's causes and for peace and human rights, as well as a chronicler of events, have taken her to more than 30 countries, some of them repeatedly over decades, from the former Soviet Union to South Africa, from the Philippines to India, from much of Western Europe to Haiti and parts of South America. She continues to produce a book a year, major talks for the lecture circuit, columns regularly for the National Catholic Reporter, and she makes appearances on radio and television here and abroad. And I must note that she has refused to even consider my request that she slow down for a few months so I can catch up. Sister Joan is often, as that Pittsburgh event points up, at the intersection of forces and events that don't normally cross paths, and often where you just don't expect to find a contemplative nun. The last time I was in the field with Sister Joan, I was quite literally in the field, bunking in a safari tent pitched in a meadow of a game preserve in northern Kenya. My tent mates were a Swami from Southern California and a former Jesuit brother, cum Buddhist, who arrived at the gathering wearing flip-flops on his feet, the same ones he had worn in his walk from Cambodia to the airport in Thailand. The scene was, if nothing else, illustrative of the span of humanity that Sister Joan can inspire to seek common cause. There was a moment during that, if I can do an aside, where I came out of the tent one morning to catch an African sunrise, and there they were, the two of them, sitting and meditating, both in positions that would have required me to be crane lifted out of there. And I walked over behind them to a normal chair, and as I was doing that, I thought, this is like walking through a New Yorker cartoon. If a Buddhist, a Hindu, and a Catholic sit down to meditate, guess whose mind isn't empty? We were three among many, meditators, chatterers, people of every political stripe, Palestinian, Israeli, Buddhist monk, Buddhist nun, the Baptist preacher peacemaker from Rwanda, the Vietnamese international care worker, the Muslim woman who establishes schools for girls in Afghanistan, the African Catholic sister draped in a habit printed with the dates of an earlier visit to her country by St. John Paul II. Tribal chiefs and holy men and women from Africa, India, Japan, Afghanistan, Australia, several countries in Europe. People had come from all over the world to observe the 10th anniversary of the Global Peace Initiative of Women, which Joan had helped found. This gathering on an African plain drew from the deepest wells of belief that had nurtured faith thousands of years in circumstances around the globe. It stretched the imagination regarding God and how God relates to us. It made dramatically clear, and at times frighteningly clear, that if the human project is to come to its fulfillment in any of those various traditions and cultures, the first step is realizing that we are all knit together. We to one another, to the earth and all it provides. If a stitch is broken, we all weaken. This wasn't cheap grace or syncretism. This was the monastery opening to the world, encountering the other, as Pope Francis might put it. Not to convert, as he also might put it, but to walk with and to understand. The images from both places, among faithful if marginalized gay Catholics seeking their place in the church, and among the world's religions, in a place where one couldn't claim positions of superiority, are significant for me in substance and symbol. They both demonstrated practical application of what Sister Joan has preached for years, that transformation of the world does not occur by avoiding the world, its complexities, and the difficult questions that arise in contending with all of that. Transformation instead occurs when we rub up against that reality outside the safety of our walls and sanctuaries and demonstrate an alternative way to live. A thick texture of truths and interlocking realities are borne out by the life of Sister Joan. Three of them, I think, are essential in any era and acutely needed in our age. First, we traffic in dangerous delusion when we think we've got God figured out. Second, faith and its religious expression is not a matter of absolute certainty at every step. Quite the opposite. If a faith doesn't tolerate questions, it fails of its own weight or becomes dangerously distorted. Third, the integrity of any organization, religious or otherwise, is seriously diminished if in practice it ignores, demeans, or subjugates half of humanity. To point one, consider the times. Preachers of many stripes love to rail about the corrosive effects of secularism and how godless U.S. culture is these days. And I would venture to say they are correct, but not in the way many of them would acknowledge. Secular as we may be, there is more God and religion in our public squares these days than ever before. God is everywhere, blessing all we do, our economics, our political system, our military adventures. We sing God Bless America at our sporting events, and our civic leaders, God bless us at every turn, and risk failing our informal but very binding religious tests if they don't. We love to call ourselves God-fearing, and many insist that we stand atop 2 centuries of firmly established Christian practice as a nation. The truth is, religion has been spread, I think, wide and thin in many cases, a veneer that serves to hide flaws and inconsistencies. In the attempt to pretty things up, we have to fashion a God in our image, small and controllable, a commodity packaged for mass marketing. We live in an age of expanding religion and a shrinking God. Our religion itself is often as corrosive of true and authentic faith as any other secular influence. Sister Joan would like to rattle those certainties and the conclusions we derive from them, and the certainty as well that God is a man and that he only wants men around him. None of us comes to our ideas about God in a vacuum. Even those of us who had to memorize all the answers in the Baltimore Catechism eventually had to use our imaginations. Our experience of authority, of men and women and religious leaders, and our institutions' interpretations all mix together over time to produce notions of God. In Sister Joan's case, that would have included an exceptionally challenging childhood, lived out in devotion to a mother who sought the best for her, while at the same time subjecting her to the kind of flinching uncertainty that came with a violent and alcoholic stepfather. Joan loved them both, her mother with a fervor that later turned to motivation in a lifelong advocacy for women. Him in the skittish way one proceeds when exposed to the kind of relationship that presents itself as protective at one moment and the next willing to destroy every bit of domestic tranquility at the slightest provocation. Sister Joan, however, would also bring to her imagination about God the long experience in a community of women who brought to the effort all manner of human ambition and flaws, courage and fear, gifts and grace. One can't tell the story of Sister Joan apart from the story of the Erie Benedictines, for it was among them where she ultimately found the possibilities of love without trauma, acceptance without fear of retribution. The story also cannot be told without understanding that Sister Joan Chittister arrived at this project, religious life in the Erie Benedictines, as a bedrock conservative, a traditionalist. She bought the whole package back then. Habits, veils, that era's version of obedience, the sister as low-paid help to an all-male clerical culture, and this woman, later labeled dissenter on so many occasions, was reluctant and slower than others in the community to rise to challenge the status quo. But when she did, when, with the help and even insistence of the community, she went beyond the monastery's borders, when she began to make the connections between her work in the academy, her life in religious community, and her lifelong experience as a woman, that's when the scales fell. And what about God? Well, in a manner of speaking, God changed. And God knows that would not be the last time someone changed, having been confronted with the thinking of Joan Chittister. In all of the material I've read, her talk titled "The God They Never Told Me About, A Convergence of Opposites" is one of my favorites, because like a reduction rendered long and over low heat, this is essential Joan Chittister, a distillation of thought which first appeared in earlier works and was refined over years. Had she not wrestled with and come to some conclusions about God, I dare say we probably would not have seen all the rest that flows from her life. Along the path of her evolving ideas of God, she discarded, quote, God the persecutor who created life in order to trap us in our own ignorance, as well as God the mighty male to whom obedience, subservience, and deference were the only proper response for a woman. She came to the conclusion that she had been looking for God in all the wrong places. Quote, that a divinity such as these is simply a graven image of ourselves, that such a deity is not a God big enough to believe in. Quote, I learned that law-keeping did not satisfy my need for meaning. I learned that fear of wrath did not seduce me to love. I learned that God, the distant doer of unpredictable and arbitrary magic, failed to engage my soul, let alone enlighten it. I learned that life was surely about far more important things than walking around in a darkened funhouse, she writes, sometimes bumping into the God who does good things and sometimes the God who does bad. She abandoned God, the stern father, who had no time for human nonsense and little time for women. God, the cloud sitter, who keeps count of our childish stumblings toward spiritual adulthood in order to exact fierce retribution from humans for being human. All of those gods, she became convinced, do not exist, never did exist, must not exist if God is really God. I have become sure, she writes, that if all I know about God is that my God is the fullness of life and the consummation of hope, the light on the way and the light at the end, I will live my life in the consciousness of God and goodness everywhere. Obscure at times, yes, but never wholly lacking. Now God, at this stage of life, that old rascal, is doing it again. I am moving, she writes, in my heart from God as a trophy to be won or a master, however benign, to be pacified, to God as cosmic unity and everlasting light. One doesn't move through those levels of understanding and arrive at the immensity of God as cosmic unity and everlasting light, a personal God who need not be modeled on our limited ideas of personhood without questioning ancient certainties and long-held presumptions about God. When it is at its best, she writes in her book In Search of Belief, religion offers more than a list of answers designed to resolve the unanswerable. It tenders a way to deal with the questions that plague our lives and puzzle our hearts. She has made the transition, she says, from, quote, faithful answers to faithful questions. When I pray, I still believe, she says, but the truth is now that I believe both a great deal less and a great deal more than I did years ago. For Joan, faith came to mean more than a tick list of orthodoxies, more than dogmatic precision, or the markers for Catholic identity by which some think all will know without question who's in and who's out. Moving from certainty to faith is part of an evolution in the Catholic world that has been underway for most of our lifetimes, and I believe we can see it occurring at every level in the community. From the bricks and mortar that once defined us to the outer world, to the change of heart by which we in the community understand who we are. In recent years, I've had the opportunity to spend time hopping around parishes in different areas of the United States and recording a lot of what I saw and heard. I did the same thing recently, but for a much briefer time in Australia. And I came away from all that convinced that the Catholic, European, Catholic, Irish project of the past 150 years, as it was expressed in these two English-speaking countries, was coming to an end. Not that the church is coming to an end, but that the project, so endowed with certitude, proudly established with grand churches, baronial residence for bishops and cardinals, with its parochial structures so dependent on rectories full of priests and convents bulging with sisters willing to work for a pittance. All of that was going away. I tried my impression or my takeaway on this idea on a distinguished church historian at Boston College, and he didn't even let me get to the end of the sentence. Not coming to an end, he said, it's over. Complicated reasons having to do with everything from sex abuse and money scandals to demographic shifts and the priest shortage are behind the diminishment we're witnessing in those old iconic sees of the Northeast and Upper Midwest. But at the bottom of it all is the realization that the old model, which served us so well for a couple of decades, no longer works. No less a traditional figure than Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York has to concede the point. In a book-length interview called People of Hope, he paints a less than hopeful picture when he says, I'm developing a theory that one of our major challenges today is that American Catholic leadership is being strangled by trying to maintain the behemoth of institutional Catholicism that we inherited from the 1940s and 50s. Excuse me. When the Cardinal Archbishop of New York feels strangled by institutional Catholicism, you know something momentous is underway. That may sound new, but if you know anything about the Good Sisters, then you knew they knew about this a long time ago. Joan wrote powerfully of these matters in her 1995 book, The Fire in These Ashes. When much of the male church was exhausting itself trying to find out how to sustain the status quo, and much of it still is, against all odds and contrary to clear empirical evidence, when they were insisting that this model was God-ordained and could not be tampered with, the sisters were quietly doing the work asked of them by the Second Vatican Council. They were deeply searching their histories, exploring their founding documents, and rediscovering why their communities were established. Individual women and their communities went through a period of deep introspection and discovery, and they came out on the other side understanding themselves quite differently from before. They understood, often long before the rest of us, that a church based on the model of a royal court, a model drawn from the examples of kings and princes, didn't have much chance of standing up to the example of the suffering servant. That's why they were out on the margins, among the poor, transforming some of the worst sections of our cities, tending to immigrants, teaching them everything from language to new work skills, in solidarity with women, single mothers, hungry and abandoned children, long before Pope Francis came along and made it unmistakably clear that that's precisely where the church should be headed. And you and Erie have witnessed that incredible work in abundance, and for a very long time. We know through the horrible story of the clergy sex abuse crisis that often the primary instinct within the male clerical culture was neither introspective in a healthy sense, nor outward in concern for the most vulnerable of the community. It was instead a display of an instinct of self-preservation. In times of turmoil, we often turn to metaphors out of the natural world. Today it feels at times as if the ground is shifting constantly beneath the church, shaking all of the old foundations. The old symbols of power are disappearing. The very edifices that once defined us are being sold off. The credibility of our leaders is compromised in ways we could not have imagined as young Catholics not that many decades ago. It is worth mentioning here that an element of institutional Catholicism of the 40s and 50s that is disappearing along with Episcopal mansions is an endless supply of women religious. I would warn against accepting the argument that the nuns have gone all soft and secular and that's why their numbers are down. And correspondingly that the cause of women religious will be rescued by more traditional orders whose numbers are skyrocketing. During one of my visits here, I interviewed Sister Phyllis Weaver, an elderly member of the community whose enthusiasm was infectious. The next morning I went to chapel with the community, and afterwards Sister Phyllis came tooling up in her electrically powered chair and said she had a thought overnight about something she'd forgotten to tell me, and maybe I'd be interested. So we went into a corner outside the chapel, and she said, in 1941, when I entered the community, there were 100 in the community and no postulants. Today, she continued, we have 100 members and one postulant. So I said, what's your conclusion from that bit of information? And she said, well, maybe we're a little too worried about numbers. I went to Joan with that information, and in her big voice way, she said, sheesh, Tom, I've been saying that for years. Turns out that she had researched the matter during her years as prioress, and discovered that between some point in the 1800s and the early 1940s, the average intake for the community was 1.5 people a year. Indeed, Catholic demographers here and in Australia had almost the same identical information and the same caution for me. Stop thinking of the 40s to mid-60s as normative. That time was, for a host of reasons, an aberration, with far more priests and nuns than either country had seen before, and more than they'll ever see again. As for the hope that some see in the new orders, the demographers again, and primary among them are those at the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University. It's an unwieldy name, but they do incredible work. They issued this warning. Some of those groups are experiencing increases, but they are tiny to begin with, so any increase in membership is going to appear huge as a percentage. There are still far more women, for instance, choosing to join what are often referred to as mainstream religious orders. However, they make far less difference percentage-wise, and there are far fewer today than 50 or 60 years ago. I firmly believe that both models had a great deal to offer the church in different circumstances and different eras. But I would also assert that an essential truth of this era is, don't bet the future on a 40s and 50s style revival of religious life. One of my favorite lines about statistics might also apply here. They're like a bikini. What's revealed is suggestive, what's hidden is vital. In the introduction to her book, Religious Life at the Crossroads, Sister Amy Hereford, citing Ecclesiastes and the life cycles of institutions, says of the diminishment religious orders are experiencing today, they are not giving up, but they are letting go of ministries and of many works and institutions they have served admirably for a century or more. They know the time is right for this. It is not defeat, but rather the completion of an impressive chapter in the history of religious life. It is not the denial of the dream, but affirmation that the dream is fulfilled. It is not dying, it is really living. New forms of life are being worked out, and we've heard about some of them here in Erie, and some of them are well underway here and elsewhere. But all of the downsizing and the rearrangement and the rethinking of things is an unsettling matter. Several questions arise that will be key to what happens in the church of the future. Will the institution deal with women as equals or continue to push back, saying that their questions cannot even be raised and that no changes can occur in our sacramental thinking or our traditions? Is our Christic imagination, as one author recently expressed it, large enough to accommodate such new questions and concerns? Are we able to imagine a new future, or are we forever stuck trying to recreate, like old Civil War reenactors, a past that is actually but a tiny slice of time? Xavier Le Pichon, a French geophysicist and ardent Catholic, is known for constructing a comprehensive model of plate tectonics and for extracting from his knowledge of the activity of the Earth's plates deep insights into human behavior. In an essay, he writes that he has come to understand that it is, quote, the weaknesses, the imperfections, the faults that facilitate the evolution of a system. A system which is too perfect is also too rigid because it doesn't think it needs to evolve. This is true in politics, it is true within a society, within families, within nature. I think it can also be inferred that his insight holds true as well for the Catholic Church and its ecclesiology. A perfect system, writes Le Pichon, is a closed system that can only evolve through a major commotion. The evolution occurs through revolutions. As evolution can occur in the natural world through the cracking of rigid rocks, in the church one might extrapolate it is occurring through the slow crumbling of ecclesial systems and traditions that have become too rigid, or that discover their usefulness has been overrun by time, circumstance, and new insights. Is it possible, and I know it is too early in his pontificate to know for certain, but is it possible that Francis's instructions to go make a mess, to cause a commotion, to not be afraid of making mistakes, are ways to aid and abet the evolution underway? Some years ago, a dear uncle of mine wrote a brief history of the Roberts family, and at the end of one section included a list of my grandmother's favorite sayings. She was a peasant from Italy's eastern shore, an uneducated, barely literate farmhand from Abruzzi when she arrived here at the turn of the last century. She died in 1961, I am certain hardly aware of the growing women's movement. But topping her list of sayings was this, and please pardon my Italian: La ragione della femmina se la mangiata l'asino, which my uncle translated, women's rights have been eaten by the donkey. And I think he was using a polite translation for that last word. It is certainly just a single anecdote, but one might make the case that an awareness exists deep in the fiber of women's beings, their own kind of ontological difference, if you will, that understands history and the world in a way unfamiliar to what has been the dominant understanding of history for too long. Male privilege, like white privilege, is difficult to discern on one's own. It's the water we swim in, the air we breathe. It takes someone outside that condition to point it out to us. A few months ago, my wife and I went to an exhibit of photographs in Washington. They were done by women working for National Geographic magazine. The locations of the shoots ranged from the gentle surf of the Jersey Shore to some of the most violent and dangerous and remote corners of the world. The exhibit drove home for me how far our storytelling about women has lagged behind our storytelling about titans, war makers, and empire builders. The photographs announced the other side of history, from the mundane to the exotic. Increasingly, from a variety of media, we are made aware of how toxic the waters of male privilege can be. From those who are still sold into slavery in the sex trade to young women burned and disfigured for going to school. Girls as young as 6 married off to men many times their age with no say in the matter and facing horrible trauma as children. And among the most common victims of our wars we know and our other national ambitions are the women left with starving children in horrible refugee camp, risking lives in search for food and water and firewood. And women, of course, are the targets of one of modern war's least technological but most destructive weapons, rape used on an unimaginable scale. Those photos and the list of stories I mentioned took on a new poignancy for me because I had been immersed in understanding or trying to understand Joan Chittister and her advocacy for women. The narratives of some of the photographs and recent news reports represent so many torn stitches, and we are all, as a result, weaker for it. Against the backdrop of these realizations, this person of Joan Chittister, whom even I had referred to from time to time as a dissenter, became something quite other. Wasn't it she, after all, who was both coherent and consistent? In all of those circumstances, including the church, her basic point is that women are locked out of so many of the decision-making circles. Their voices simply are not heard, their perspectives not considered. At the end of his Passion Sunday homily this year, Pope Francis asked us to consider the question, am I like those leaders who went to the next day to Pilate and said, look, this man said that he was going to rise again. We cannot let another fraud take place. And who block life, who block the tomb in order to maintain doctrine, lest life come forth. Now, I think that's a profound question and a striking use of the image. At the same time, it invites a turning of that question on the male clerical culture itself. Is a defense of a God, imagined primarily by men, for men and their ambitions, to be used in service of an all-male culture, perhaps blocking life to preserve not even doctrine, but tradition? I feel compelled to make a point here. I am not anti-hierarchy or anti-male clergy. Priests have played an important and influential role in my life. I have rather come to conclude that a healthy hierarchy, leadership however that is construed, has to include more than celibate males. We have reached, I believe, a kind of ecclesial men are from Mars, women are from Venus moment. It portends nothing but trouble should men in leadership continue down the path of simply not allowing women anywhere near the decision-making councils of the church. It makes no sense, and it isn't at all healthy. In her book called To Question, Joan writes of women's situation. I think that is the real lesson of this period. If you want to be treated as a full human being, an adult, a peer, you must claim it for yourself and then let them all deal with it later. Which is pretty much what she did in 2001 when she was threatened with expulsion from her order and worse if she went ahead with a planned speech at a conference in Ireland on women's ordination. There is a dramatic moment Joan described for me and that Sister Christine Vladimirov, who was prioress when the scene occurred, confirmed for me. Christine had called Joan saying she needed to see her. From the transcript of my interview with Joan. When I get there, I sit down on the couch and she sits about there. She said, I got this letter. I said, oh? She hands it to me. I see the Vatican stamp on it. I open it up and I start to read it. I've heard in other books that this has happened to people. Up to that moment in my adult life, it had never happened to me. I had known fear as a child that was physical, but I was long past that one, and I doubled over. I had literally been kicked in the stomach. I stayed over like this for 10 or 15 seconds, and I stood up and said, Christine, before there's any discussion, before we say a single word, there's something I need to tell you. She said, yes. I said, I'm going to Dublin. She said, I thought you'd say that. I said, I'm going. These men are not going to do this. They have no right. Joan continued in the interview. This was not a women's issue to me. This was a justice issue that happened to be rooted in the women's question. It was a matter of who do you think you are that you can tell me what to think, tell me to whom I may speak, tell me where I can or cannot go. Who do you think you are, Daddy? I'm a big grown-up girl, and I can go into this myself, and trust me, I will maintain my faith, and I will be a member of the church. This doesn't make me a moral infant or an immoral woman. And if we have to shoot this out in the street, we're going to, because I'm going. I'm going. She went. And she gave a talk not on women's ordination, but about discipleship. And there was considerable more drama around the event, and a lot of suffering for that community. It included a unanimous show of solidarity from the community here and an investigation by an archbishop and a sister who essentially ended up finding nothing amiss with Joan's writing or the activities of the Erie Benedictines. So perhaps it all ends well. And a little more than a year into a different papacy, we are experiencing a kinder, gentler church. Still, it isn't bishops who have utterly failed to protect children, who have continued to protect abusive priests, including a bishop convicted criminally of a count of endangering children who are disciplined. They remain in office or go quietly into retirement. It is the sisters who are investigated, and priests who dare encourage or talk about the ordination of women who are the ones defrocked and banished from the clerical culture. In my most optimistic, even hopeful moments, I tend to see these glaring inconsistencies and, I dare say, hypocrisies as signs of the weaknesses in the brittle crust of the ecclesial landscape. It is along these fault lines that the eruptions, already underway in the manner of a super slow motion implosion, will continue. In the meantime, Joan herself has provided with her life a template for staying the course, and in her writing a rationale for doing so. In what I am told is the most requested piece of writing out of the, zillion words or so that she's put on paper or computer screen, an essay titled Why I Stay, she describes membership in the Catholic community as a process. The journey itself is more important than the destination, she writes. We all know that Joan knows the church's inconsistencies, the deficiency of its theology of ordination that excludes women. She knows the leaders who, quote, ignore women who are in their churches, waiting to hear themselves imagined in the God who made us in God's own image, both male and female. She also knows the Jesus who wept over Jerusalem, betrayed by the very place he loved, the Jesus contesting with the Pharisees, the Jesus presiding over Seder, true to the end, to the truths of the Scripture, which insist in our time too, and that before it's all over, however much evil we encounter on the way, the presence of God shall prevail. I have no model of Jesus the triumphant, she writes, only of Jesus the faithful and God the present one. She stays in this church, quote, a restless pilgrim, not because I don't believe what the church has taught me, but precisely because I do. I believed in the Jesus they showed me, who listened to women and taught theology to women, and sent women to teach theology to the apostles, and even raised women from the dead. And I also stay in the church because there is nowhere else I know that satisfies in me what the church itself teaches us to seek, a sacramental life that makes all life sacred. What you are doing here these days, Mercyhurst and Greater Erie, is extremely important. For you represent a significant step in preserving that other side of history that too often has gone lost. A side of history that, again in my hopeful moments, and they are many, I see in the ascendancy. Joan recently was asked to give a talk in an unusual setting, a gathering of archivists. Why, she asked herself, would they want to hear from me, and what did they expect to hear? But this is, first and last, a woman formed by deep traditions, and she recalled some Benedictine history. That Benedictine monasteries, men's and women's, became, quote, the sole civic anchor and agricultural organizer of peasant populations from about the 2nd or 3rd to the 13th century. These monasteries were centers of art and education, and it is widely held that they saved European culture itself. Yet when women's monasteries went out of existence because of marauding bands or sheer poverty, not one of their archives was saved. Quote, so despite the fact that their lives and works were exactly like the male communities we have all been taught to revere, she told the archivist, an entire subculture of women was simply allowed to vanish, their wisdom demeaned, their experiences ignored, their contributions buried with them. You are to be congratulated, Mercyhurst and Erie, for not allowing that to happen here, for not shunning or dismissing prophets in your midst, but for embracing them. How important that years from now anyone, but especially young women, will have access to the archive you've just opened. They'll be able to look in on the life of this most unlikely prophet from this city on the northern edge of the country. In Joan's story, a certain symmetry exists, one might suggest, with our sacred texts. Out of relative obscurity emerges a powerful and essential witness. And in that vein, one might also imagine this Joan Chittister, certainly not one to block life for the sake of doctrine, in that long ago, going out, fearless and curious, ahead of her brother disciples and running that early Sunday morning to the tomb, determined to roll away the rock and finding that life indeed had already won. Thank you.
Tom Roberts, thank you so very much for your poignant reflections on the life of Sister Joan Chittister. We look forward to your full biography when it's ready. Thank you. Now, before Sister Joan comes up here, I have to be honest with you. How, especially at the end of this incredible day, do I introduce Joan Chittister? I'm not going to try, but I have one sentence. I think it's a sentence. I used to be an English teacher. I want to ask you to welcome a woman with the courage of a prophet and the soul of a mystic, Sister Joan Chittister.
Oh, yeah? Well, look, folks. I don't know about you, but I have a problem. I don't know. If you're sitting there with great honesty and wondering, what in God's name are we doing at an event like this? Trust me, I've been doing the same all day long. I said, well, what is going on here? It's me, Joan Chittister. This is impossible to be in a situation like I'm in today and tonight. I mean, after all, friends, no one even knows how to pronounce my name, let alone be able to spell well enough to put it on a wall. So, and I know that. I've lived with this all my life. I had a professor at Notre Dame years ago who never took more than 12 students in any seminar, and then he would say the roll out loud every single day of the term. He would sit at the head of the table, class list in hand, reading intently like this. First day, Chittister, John. Drajewski, Marianne. Shibishevich, Stanley. Chittister, Sister Mary Peter Chittister. I said, Chittister, Dr. Sullivan. And he said, sorry about that, sister. So he came in the second day. He said, Chittister, John. Drajewski, Marianne. Shibishevich, Stanley, Chittister, Sister Mary Peter Chittister. I said, Chittister, Dr. Sullivan, Chittister. He said, sister, okay. He came in the third day. He said, Chittister, John, Zdrajewski, Mary Ann, Shibashevsky, Stanley, Chittister, Sister Mary, Peter Chittister. I said, Dr. Sullivan, it's Chittister, Chittister, Chittister. He said, sister, I'm so embarrassed. He said, I'm going to learn to say your name if I have to stay up all night. And the next day he came in and he said, Chittister, John, Zdrajewski, Mary Ann, Shibashevich, Stanley, Chittister, Sister Mary Patrick, Chittister. By the time I got back across campus to Keenan Hall, there was a 10-foot sheet hanging out the second floor window that said, Happy Feast Day, Sister Mary Patrick. I've been John Who ever since, and as far as I'm concerned, nothing changes tonight. But I have been thinking about tonight, hard and long, from 2 points of view. The first is from the Zen master, who says the purpose of life is to see. Well, tonight is about what Tom Roberts saw about the progress of life as he wrote this biography. And it's also about what Helen Boyle saw as important in life. And it's about, too, what I myself have seen in life, thanks to the people who have formed me. And finally, it's about what I think we must all see as the function of our own archives, I think, if the future we leave to our children is ever to be as good as our past. Tom Roberts is one of the most insightful, you know that now, most objective Catholic journalists in the United States today. He sees without prejudice, and he speaks without personal bias. And he writes to enable us all to see what's going on, both in us and around us, in both church and state. Tom Roberts is a Zen master's dream. If the question is, what did Tom Roberts see as he wrote this biography? My personal answer is way too much. He's the proverbial little brother, the kind you want to smother when your parents come home asking, okay, what did you kids do while we were out? He tells everything he knows. What did he see tonight? He saw that a person doesn't have to come from a perfect life to have a good life. He saw that voices that dare to speak out in society, both yours and mine, enable everybody else to also become involved in the great enterprise of conscious reflection on the nature of their own state and church. He saw that the work of women religious has been the transformation of the world, the conversion of the church in this period, not simply the education of the young. He saw that faith does not deny questions. It grows and deepens and makes faith real. And he also saw that neither the world nor the church will ever be whole until its women have as much to do with shaping it at every level as its men do. And most of all, he makes the point for all of us tonight that though nothing we do will ever change our past, every single thing we do changes the future. We each live in the spotlight of personal conscience, each of us. And so we each in the end bear some personal responsibility for this culture we criticize and this church for which we hope and its consequences. One of those people who took that kind of responsibility is here tonight, unseen but fully felt, full of life, vibrant and visionary, gone, yes, but still very, very present. Helen Boyle, Mercyhurst class of 1934, to whose memory these archives are dedicated, is yet a giant of future building. She was a matriarch, a mover, and a maker of more fruitful tomorrows for many. Helen was a visionary who saw far beyond the boundaries of her own life. Years ago, I said of Helen in a book I dedicated to her then, to Helen Boyle, a saint of our times who made more possible than anyone ever knew. Very quietly, she supported both artists and interfaith conferences, both the poorest of the poor and hundreds of small third world communities around the world that still thrive, thanks to her foresight. At every dinner party, in every conversation, Helen deliberately sparked debate and consciously rewarded thought, even ideas other than her own. She opened doors and hearts everywhere. And in my case, she bought me my very first computer. Before I owned that computer, Sister Maureen tells me, I had written one book. After that, they say I wrote over 50. Come to think about it, the world may not thank her for that. But what is in these archives, Helen Boyle did a great deal to start. Most of all, Helen bred that same kind of vision and determination into her family, into John and Mary and Michael and Miggy and Peter and Pat. They are the inheritors of her spirit as your children are of yours, whatever it is. They are the keepers of her legacy as your children will be of yours if you make it clear to them. And so in their own times, they are also bridge builders like Helen to a better world of such people. And of such people, the future is made. John Coleman the Younger wrote, when you reach a plateau in life, remember to praise the bridges that carried you over. My bridge builders have been so many. First, you know now and clearly, my Benedictine community seeded my beginning and then freed it to become. It gave me roots that stabilized me despite the winds of change. This Benedictinism thing is a community, it's a tradition that nurtures possibility. Without them, I could never have moved beyond the boundaries of the past to commit myself to the building of tomorrow. Because of this Benedictine tradition, these sisters, these personal friends, this great creative team with whom I work, I have been made to look much better than I really am. Second, Penn State University introduced me to the wider world, gave me the wings I needed to go beyond the past to a broader world than simply the Catholic enclave. At Penn State, I found other ways of thinking, other ways of being in the world. I learned at Penn State to understand change, to respect differences, and to honor the past by embracing a more dynamic future. And these became the instruments of peace I needed to take into a world at war. And finally, so strong was Mercyhurst University's uncompromising dedication to rigorous scholarship, even on an undergraduate level, and Mercyhurst's witness to mercy for all. I was able to go around the world from Erie, Pennsylvania, to speak to people from every tradition and culture without apology for my small town education. In fact, proud of the preparation I'd gotten in these halls. And I beg the Mercyhurst students here tonight to understand that you are here to go around the world too, that you are here to learn, to take what you learn here, to leaven a world as good as this one. And if it doesn't happen, it's your fault, because this university will prepare you to do it. For all those places and their integrity, for all of my friends and their support, for all those learnings and proddings to go beyond myself with the future in mind, I will be always grateful. Chardin is my other guide to tonight, however, and Chardin writes, "The only task worthy of our efforts is to construct the future. Each of us here and now is meant to bridge one generation with another, the past to the future and the future to the past, so that those who come after us may have stars to steer by." That is the universal vocation. And that's what it means to open an archive, as we did today. Archives are clearly designed for those who will come after us, so that they can come to understand these times and to recognize the underlying engines of social change that moved us and define our society's most sweeping transformation, its soundest ideals, its clearest examples of what it took to be human in inhuman situations, and then quietly and carefully to hang them all on the tree of life for tomorrow to see and take hope from the struggles we're going through today. But if archives are not kept to do these things, who cares? After all, what will be lost? Let me fill out the example that Tom hinted at from my own life. Well, no, let's correct that. Let me describe for you a disaster in the record of humankind that is demonstrated by my own life and what went on here today. I am a Benedictine sister. That means 1,500 years of Benedictinism, which make it the oldest religious order in the Church. In fact, the only living institution older than the Benedictine order in the Catholic Church is the Church itself. From the 6th to the 13th century, this single religious order became the anchor of these peasant populations who were being driven off their lands from one end of Europe to another by waves of internecine war. They barely settled down until the attacks started again. And these early Benedictine communities built in such a way, for instance, that people could cross a continent in chaos and still sleep safely every night in a Benedictine guest house, just one day's ride away from the Benedictine guest house they had slept in the night before. And in case you're missing the commercial, I want to point out that Benedictines, I'm saying, opened the first holiday inns in Europe. Point, they were not out of touch. Being out of touch is not a religious virtue if you believe in the Jesus who walked from Galilee to Jerusalem, raising the dead, healing the sick, and contesting the answers of the day. These Benedictine communities, men and women, opened schools and infirmaries. They copied manuscripts, they preserved the arts, and during that period, they built the great cathedrals of Europe as well. Historians still today say that it was Benedictines, men and women, who saved the culture of Europe. And yet, when the monasteries of Benedictine women, less endowed and so less secure, crumbled under these continuous barbarian attacks or the burdens of poverty, not one archive from a woman's community that closed in all those hundreds of years was kept. Not one. Not one male monastery, not one barony, not one of the great new universities absorbed those archives. So despite the fact that their lives and works were exactly like the male communities before them, an entire culture of women was simply allowed to vanish. Their experiences ignored, their wisdom demeaned, their contributions buried with them. And with the loss of those archives of women's communities, the history of women's organizations in Europe were lost. The history of men's organizations became the only model left of an institution centuries old. The stories of women, their chronicles and logs and letters and lineage and spiritual profundity simply fell off the face of the earth, disregarded, leaving no tracks for other women at other times to follow. To this day, as women Benedictines, we know almost nothing about a history that's 1,500 years old. We know almost nothing about our great national leaders everywhere, our dreams, our devastations, or our centuries-old learnings about what it means to be either impacting or involved as independent spiritual women. We know only that they were there and gone and made invisible. As a young sister, I set out to discover the works of women's monasteries myself. So I went to the source. I went to the library. I went to the work of an esteemed Benedictine scholar who had written a 2-volume history of the Benedictine order. The first volume was on Benedictine men, and after pressure, he gave in and wrote a second volume on Benedictine women, the introduction to which reads to this day, tonight, "It is not a woman's work to make history, so there is little to write here." As a result, women Benedictines stand deprived of centuries of history that men everywhere take for granted. What would those women from those centuries want today for the sisters who followed them, for the women they taught, for the generations they educated? We don't know. And we have no way to find out. And as a result, centuries of women and their works have been lost to your decision-making and mine. And why did that happen? Why did that happen? It happened because Penn State University and Mercyhurst University and their clear recognition of the worth of women's works weren't there. It happened because people like you, like Helen Boyle and her family, weren't there to recognize its value and to require its ongoing existence. That's why it happened. Clearly, without archives, a society loses its memory. Whole peoples are made inconspicuous. The world ignores the richness of difference, or the lessons of social change, or the paths that were tried and failed, the paths that were trodden over, the paths that were never tried at all. And so those ideas fade in the mist of the years. But the archives of a people hold the key to the imagination that drove it and the vision it bore. Archives are the real keepers of any culture. Culture, history, ideas, information, and the concerns of a period all hide in somebody's archives, waiting to be found, waiting to be dealt with, waiting to be saved and seen again, waiting to enlighten another way, if we will only look. if there's only something there for us to see. Archives give society the time it takes to understand what the present has really been about. Schopenhauer wrote, "Life must be lived forward, yes, but it can only be understood backward." In a hectic, connected, technological world where 24 hours of daily information now trumps the process of understanding, it's archivists and archives that make later reflection possible. They are our only guarantee that newspaper stories and Facebook and Twitter do not become our substitute for history. They enable a people to realize that the early signs of global warming, ignored or underreported, were really more important than simply the dating of the storm. Archives are the missing link in the daisy chain of experience. Clearly, the slivers of materials kept in archives expose for us both the brilliant and the brutal, so that the brutal can be forsworn, and so that the brilliant can be amplified for the sake of the world. Archives, then, are both the lighthouse and the hermit's cave of the world, where old ideas are kept so that new thinking can begin. And why is that important in a world that amasses information? They tell the story of a Westerner on his first safari who force-marched his native guides through the jungle in ruthless search for game. They made good time the first 2 days, but on the third morning, the hunter found the guides sitting on their haunches doing absolutely nothing to prepare for that day's excursion. Why aren't they getting ready to move on? The Westerner demanded. Because, the old chief explained, they're waiting for their souls to catch up with their bodies. Someday, the archives we open tonight will remind people, as the Zen master taught, that the purpose of life is to see. They will repeat what Tom Roberts has seen for us, and what Helen Boyle envisioned for us, and what Penn State University and Mercyhurst and the Erie Benedictines have built for us. And they will inscribe for posterity the efforts we ourselves made, as Chardin said, to construct a better future. Archives are the rear guard of every society. They have the last word about what that era and its people were all about, so that our national soul might eventually someday contemplate its meanings and catch up with our fevered, agitated minds. So thank you for coming. Thanks to all of you for being part of this piece of the future. Thank you for requiring that a woman's history too be kept for the sake of other women and men to come, not so that we might walk in the footsteps of the past, but as the poet Basho writes, that we might seek what they sought and do it better. Thank you. God bless you for coming.
Thanks to all of you for sharing this holy and historic evening with us tonight.